Just a horrific scene playing out in Manchester, England. An explosion at an Ariana Grande concert at the Manchester Arena.
Oh my God.
Salman Abedi spent 2 hours around Manchester Arena and adjoining train station before the blast.
The picture shows him on Monday. He travelled from the flat where he assembled the bomb towards suicide and slaughter.
The bomb exploded outside the arena, leaving 22 dead and 59 injured.
Police are saying they're treating this incident as a possible terrorist incident, although as of right now...
May 22nd, 2017, Manchester, United Kingdom. An evening that started like any other, slowly turning into one of the darkest nights in modern British history. The sun was setting over the city, casting a warm glow across the streets as thousands of people made their way toward one destination, the Manchester Arena. You could feel the excitement in the air, groups of teenagers laughing, parents walking alongside their children, phones out, documenting every second. Because for many of them, this wasn't just a concert, it was a moment they had been waiting for, sometimes for months. Inside the venue, preparations had already been completed. Lights tested, sound systems ready, security positioned, staff briefed. Everything appeared normal. Everything felt safe. That illusion would not last. At exactly 6 p.m., the arena doors opened, and within minutes, the controlled lines outside turned into a steady stream of people pouring in. Security checks were happening, but like at many large events, the focus was on the main arena entrances. Beyond those checkpoints, there were areas that felt less controlled, less guarded spaces that existed in between, and it was exactly there where everything would later unfold. By 6:34 p.m., a young man entered the city room, a large public foyer connecting the arena to Victoria Station. Unlike the main arena floor, this area was accessible without a ticket. People moved freely through it, arriving, leaving, waiting. It was busy, but not heavily monitored in the same way.
Salman Abedi spent 2 hours around Manchester Arena and adjoining train station before the blast.
On his back, the man carried a large, heavy-looking backpack. Nothing about him immediately triggered panic. No one screamed. No one ran. Because nothing about him, at least on the surface, seemed different from the hundreds of others moving through that space. But inside that bag was a carefully constructed, improvised explosive device, packed with metal fragments, designed not just to kill but to maximize injury, chaos, and fear. At 7:30 p.m., the concert began. Inside the arena, over 14,000 people were gathered, the majority young girls, teenagers, many accompanied by parents who either stood nearby or waited outside. The atmosphere was electric. Music blasted through the speakers, lights danced across the crowd, and voices rose together in unison as Ariana Grande took the stage. For those inside, it was pure joy. For the man outside, it was timing. While the crowd focused on the performance, he moved quietly through the surrounding areas. At 8:36 p.m., he was seen heading toward the men's toilets, not running, not rushing, just moving like anyone else would. He was briefly noticed by security personnel and transport officers, but there was no immediate escalation, no intervention. Moments like this would later become critical, because they were chances, and those chances slipped away. He reappeared again, this time on the mezzanine level of the city room, a slightly elevated position, giving him a clearer view of the area below. From there, he could observe movement patterns, entry points, exit flows. He wasn't guessing, he was calculating. At 9:13 p.m., he moved toward the tram platform, blending into the movement of people coming and going. But he didn't leave. Instead, he turned back. At 9:33 p.m., he made what would become his final approach into the city room. This time, He positioned himself in a location that was not fully covered by CCTV cameras, a blind spot. Whether that choice was intentional or coincidental would later be debated, but the result was the same. He remained there, waiting for nearly an hour, completely still at times, then pacing slightly, watching, listening. As the concert moved toward its final songs, the timing became critical. Because anyone familiar with large events knows the most crowded moment is not when people enter, it's when they leave. At 10:12 p.m., the show was nearing its end. Inside, the final songs played. Fans sang louder than ever, unaware that just outside, the conditions for maximum devastation were forming. At this point, something happened that would later stand out in every investigation. A member of the public noticed him. Something didn't feel right. Maybe it was the way he stood. Maybe the size of the bag. Maybe instinct. They approached him. They asked him directly, "What's in the bag?" Think about that moment. A random civilian sensing something was wrong, doing what many wouldn't have the courage to do. After the interaction, the concern was reported to security, but the response? Uncertainty. Miscommunication. Someone believed that others were already aware of him, that the situation had already been assessed, and because of that assumption, no one acted. One security staff member even considered approaching him, but hesitated, later stating discomfort, uncertainty, and even fear of being perceived as discriminatory without clear cause. Seconds of doubt, minutes of hesitation, decisions that, in hindsight, became impossible to ignore. Then came 10:31 p.m. The concert ended. Thousands of people began moving toward the exits at once, funneled into the city room area near Victoria Station. Parents waited to meet their children. Some stood checking their phones. Others scanned the crowd, searching for familiar faces. It was loud, busy, normal. And then, without warning, a flash, a deafening explosion. And in less than a second, everything changed.
Oh my God.
10:31 p.m. Manchester Arena. The moment the explosion triggered, time didn't just slow down, it fractured. A sudden, violent blast tore through the city room foyer near Victoria Station, where thousands of people were gathered in tight movement patterns after the concert had just ended. The sound wasn't just loud, it was physically overwhelming. A shockwave that pushed through air, bodies, walls, glass, metal. For a split second, there was nothing but impact. Then came silence. Not peace, but the kind of silence that happens when the human brain cannot immediately process what it is experiencing. And then everything collapsed into chaos. People were thrown off their feet instantly. Some were knocked backward several meters. Others fell into the crowd as panic spread faster than understanding. The air filled with dust, smoke, debris, and the sharp metallic smell of destruction. Screams began almost immediately, but they weren't organized or coherent. They were fragmented, disoriented, coming from everywhere at once. No one knew what had happened. Some thought it was a structural collapse. Others believed it was an electrical failure. Very few immediately understood the truth. But everyone understood one thing. Something had gone terribly wrong. Inside, the blast radius, the damage was catastrophic. Shrapnel embedded into bodies, glass shattered across the floor, and metal fragments tore through clothing, skin, and barriers. The device had not been designed for a single target. It had been designed for maximum spread, maximum injury, maximum terror. People tried to move, but movement itself was difficult. The ground was covered in debris, broken materials, and injured individuals calling out for help. Some were conscious but unable to stand. Others were unconscious immediately. A number of victims never had a chance to react at all. Within seconds, the city room transformed from a transit space into a disaster zone. And yet, in the middle of that destruction, something else emerged. Human instinct. People began helping each other without hesitation. Strangers pulled strangers away from danger. Coats, shirts, scarves were used as makeshift bandages. People pressed clothing against wounds to slow bleeding. Some used walls for support while dragging injured individuals toward exits. But the confusion was still overwhelming. Phones rang unanswered. Parents shouted names into the chaos. Children screamed for mothers and fathers who couldn't be seen in the smoke-filled crowd. Inside the arena itself, many initially didn't understand what had happened outside. The concert had ended only moments before. Staff began guiding people out as normal evacuation procedures began. But as more reports came in, the situation became clear. This was not an accident. At 10:39 p.m., British Transport Police declared a major incident. Emergency protocols were activated. Within minutes, additional units were dispatched across Manchester. Ambulances, fire services, tactical response teams, all moving toward the arena. At 10:47 p.m., it was officially treated as a terrorist incident. Outside, streets filled rapidly with emergency vehicles. Sirens echoed across the city, lights reflected off buildings. Crowds gathered in confusion at a distance, many still unaware of the full scale of what had just occurred inside. Inside the city room, emergency response was already underway, but it was overwhelmed from the start. The sheer number of injured individuals meant immediate triage was impossible to manage in a structured way. Some victims were moved manually by police officers, security staff, and members of the public before professional medical teams could fully arrive. The reality was brutal. Time mattered, and there wasn't enough of it. At 11 p.m., hospitals across Manchester began receiving wave after wave of casualties. Ambulances arrived continuously, some carrying multiple patients at once. Doctors were called in urgently, operating rooms prepared for mass trauma cases. Some patients arrived with life-threatening injuries caused by fragmentation, wounds, internal trauma, or severe blood loss. Among the injured were children and teenagers who had been at the concert just minutes earlier. Families were separated in the chaos, some still inside the arena, others already transported to hospitals, and many still unaccounted for in the immediate aftermath. By 1:10 a.m., official confirmation began to emerge. Multiple fatalities, dozens of critically injured, and many still missing or unidentified. The final confirmation would come later, but the number was already beginning to form in public awareness. 22 lives lost, including the youngest victim, an 8-year-old child who had come to the concert with family, like so many others that night.
Exploded outside the arena, leaving 22 dead and 59 injured.
As dawn approached, the emotional weight of what had happened began to settle across the city. Manchester was awake, but not functioning in any normal sense. Streets were quieter than usual, but filled with emergency activity. People stood outside hospitals waiting for updates. Families gathered in uncertainty. The city felt suspended between shock and grief. At the same time, official statements began to emerge. Authorities confirmed the attack, confirmed the number of injured, confirmed the scale of the incident. And slowly a name began to surface in investigations. The attacker had been identified as Salman Abedi, a 22-year-old man born in Manchester to Libyan parents. What shocked investigators most was not only the attack itself, but how ordinary his background initially appeared. A local upbringing, education in the UK, familiar surroundings, no immediate outward indication of what was to come. But as investigators would later uncover, beneath that ordinary surface, a long process of radicalization had taken place, and he had not acted alone in isolation. As the investigation expanded, another name emerged, Salman Abedi, his brother, who would later be linked to logistical support and preparation of materials used in the attack. But at that moment, in the early hours after the explosion, none of that fully mattered yet to those on the ground, because the priority was survival, treatment, to identification, and trying to understand how something like this could happen in a place filled with music, celebration, and children. The city of Manchester was no longer the same, and the night was still not over. In the hours after the explosion, Manchester was no longer just dealing with an attack, it was dealing with the scale of its consequences. Emergency services continued working through the night without pause. Hospitals across the region were stretched but organized under extreme pressure. Doctors, nurses, paramedics, and surgeons worked in rotation, many without rest, treating trauma cases that ranged from severe shrapnel injuries to life-threatening internal damage. Every incoming ambulance represented another unknown story, another family waiting somewhere in the dark. By early morning, the confirmation became unavoidable. 22 people had died. Dozens more were critically injured, and hundreds were affected in ways that would not immediately be visible. Psychological trauma, loss, shock, and grief that would extend far beyond the night itself. Among the victims were children, teenagers, parents, people who had simply gone to a concert. A night meant for music had ended in irreversible loss. As investigators began reconstructing the timeline, surveillance footage from the arena and surrounding areas became crucial. It showed the final movements of the attacker before the explosion, walking through public spaces, carrying a backpack, blending into crowds, moving through the city room area repeatedly without drawing enough intervention to stop him. That attacker was identified as Salman Abedi, a 22-year-old born and raised in Manchester. On the surface, his life had appeared ordinary: education, family ties, familiarity with the city itself. But beneath that surface, investigators uncovered a gradual and complex process of radicalization that had taken place over several years. Influences, ideology, travel, and contact with extremist environments all contributed to a shift that was not sudden but progressive. He had traveled to Libya multiple times, including regions where instability and militant presence were known to exist. These journeys would later become key focus points in understanding how his mindset developed and how external influences may have shaped his actions. But investigators also quickly realized something critical. He had assistance. His younger brother, Salman Abedi, was later linked to involvement in planning and preparation. Evidence suggested he assisted in acquiring materials and supporting the construction of the device used in the attack before fleeing the UK. This shifted the investigation from a single actor to a coordinated network of responsibility. At the same time, questions began to emerge about prevention. How did someone known to authorities move so freely? How were warning signs interpreted or missed?
Everybody concerned with security at the arena should have been doing their job.
And why did earlier intelligence not lead to stronger intervention? These questions became the foundation of one of the largest public inquiries in UK history. The Manchester Arena Inquiry examined every stage of the event in detail, from security arrangements at the venue to police response to intelligence handling by national security agencies. Over time, the findings revealed a pattern that was difficult to accept. Not a single failure, but a combination of small breakdowns that aligned at the worst possible moment. Communication gaps, delayed assessments, misinterpreted intelligence, uncoordinated responses. Individually, each issue seemed manageable. Together, they created vulnerability. One of the most painful conclusions involved missed opportunities before the attack. Intelligence linked to Abedi had been received prior to the bombing, but was not fully escalated in time to prevent his final actions. In hindsight, those fragments of information could have changed the outcome, but at the time, they were not connected in a way that triggered immediate action. Another critical area was emergency response. The inquiry found that while bravery and dedication were overwhelming among responders, coordination in the early minutes was insufficient. Confusion over command structure, delayed entry of medical teams, and lack of immediate triage planning meant that some injured individuals did not receive urgent care as quickly as they might have under a more streamlined system. One victim, in particular, became symbolic of this failure. A man who remained conscious for an extended period without medical assistance, despite being reachable. His case highlighted how timing in emergency response can directly influence survival outcomes. Despite these findings, the inquiry also emphasized something important. Human response in the moment was extraordinary. Police officers ran toward danger. Security staff attempted to assist despite uncertainty. Civilians stayed behind to help the injured rather than evacuate immediately. Medical teams worked under extreme conditions to save lives. In the middle of chaos, there were acts of courage that prevented even greater loss. But the central truth remained unchanged. The attack had exposed weaknesses in systems designed to prevent exactly this kind of event. In the years that followed, reforms began to take shape. Security protocols at public venues were strengthened. Staff training was improved. Communication systems between agencies were revised. Intelligence handling procedures were updated to ensure that lower-level signals received more urgent assessment when patterns appeared concerning. National counterterrorism strategy also evolved, focusing more heavily on lone actors, self-radicalized individuals, and threats developing beneath traditional detection thresholds. Public policy changes followed as well, including proposals such as Protect Duty, often referred to as Martin's Law, named after one of the victims. The aim was simple but significant: to ensure venues and public spaces take stronger responsibility for assessing and mitigating terrorist threats. But even with reforms, one question remained in public consciousness: could it have been fully prevented? The official conclusion was complex. Some opportunities were missed. Some intelligence was not acted on quickly enough, but no single point guaranteed prevention. Only a chain of events that, if broken early enough, might have changed everything. For the families, those conclusions were difficult to carry. They provided answers but not closure, because closure implies an ending. And for many affected, the impact never truly ends. In the years since, Manchester itself has changed, but not in the way terrorism intended. Instead of division, there was unity. Instead of fear, there was resilience. Instead of silence, there were memorials, tributes, and continued remembrance. The lives lost that night were not reduced to statistics or headlines. They became names, stories, voices carried forward in public memory. And while the attack at Manchester Arena remains one of the darkest nights in modern UK history, it also became something else over time, a turning point that reshaped how a nation thinks about security, vulnerability, and collective responsibility. Because in the end, what was taken that night was not only lives, it was innocence, certainty, and the belief that such moments could never happen there. And what remained was a city determined not to be defined by what tried to destroy it.